Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. The Lieutenant Governor's Office refers a handful of complaints about a shadowy anti-trans PAC to the Utah Attorney General. The 2025 legislature, lawmakers are still mostly white and male, but getting more diverse. And Utah's Latter-day Saint versus non-Latter-day Saint divide, how it complicates dating, sex, and the quest for lasting love. Those are some of the stories we'll be talking about today. And later in the hour, we'll have a conversation with Salt Lake Tribune culture and music reporter Palak Jaiswal. We begin with State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern. Emily, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So I want to talk about several of your stories from this week. First of all, this political action committee, here's the headline. Lieutenant Governor's Office refers a handful of complaints about this shadowy anti-trans political action committee to the Utah Attorney General. What is this PAC?
Right. So this PAC, I actually started seeing ads from it back in October. It had started sending out texts and mailers to people who were living in districts where either there was a Democratic state lawmaker running or there was a race where maybe it was a little bit more competitive for the Democratic candidate. And, you know, these ads were saying that they were targeting people who had voted against laws that have placed restrictions on transgender Utahns. Like earlier this year, you know, there was the bill that essentially barred transgender people from using the restrooms and locker rooms that align with their gender identity in government-owned buildings. Or like, you know, the ban on gender-affirming care for transgender youth in the state. And it said that, you know, the language that it used was, you know, pretty partisan, aligned with folks who would support those kinds of bills. It said things like, this lawmaker voted against Utah's girls. This lawmaker wants to allow men in women's bathrooms. And so they were putting out a lot of messaging around these races. And so typically, you know, when you see that coming from a political action committee, you can go to the state's disclosures website and see who organized the PAC, who's spending money on it, and where that PAC is spending money. But, you know, as you go to the state's disclosures website, even as you know, that deadline passed for general election reporting and at the end of October, it said that it had raised $0 and had spent $0. And so, you know, apparently I know of at least one complaint that was submitted, but according to the Lieutenant Governor's Office, there were a handful of complaints that were submitted over this PAC allegedly skirting campaign finance laws. And so, you know, that's something that I'd been following, wanted to make sure, you know, wanted to keep an eye on to see where these ads were actually coming from. It actually disclosed its first contribution on November 30th, just over 3 weeks after the election. And it was $120,000 from the Speaker of the Utah House of Representatives, Mike Schultz. Who, you know, he is the top lawmaker in the House, actually, you know, is the Democratic lawmakers, the Democratic representatives are operating under his gavel as he's, you know, spending this kind of money for this messaging against them, including Utah's only openly LGBTQ plus lawmaker. And so, yeah, it was pretty interesting. But quite the PAC.
Of course, you know, messaging of all kinds is, you know, what happens in campaigns. I guess the problem here is they're allegedly skirting laws, especially the transparency. You should be able to know who's giving this messaging. So did Speaker Schultz respond? Did he say anything about this?
Yeah, well, I reached out to him and asked, after seeing that's the only contribution still that's been disclosed. And asked if he had, a decision-making role with the PAC or if he knew who organized the PAC. And, he didn't really answer those questions, but provided a statement in which he said, defending Utah values is the right thing to do. These principles are the foundation of who we are, and I will always fight to protect them.
So, as far as we know, that his contribution was the only one, or do we know of any others?
We don't know of any others yet. When we'll have a little bit more information probably when we hit the year-end reporting deadline. And we'll see. So those complaints that I mentioned earlier, that were submitted to the Lieutenant Governor's office, I'd reached out to the Lieutenant Governor's office to ask what it had done to look into those, how many complaints it had gotten. And it said that it had referred those complaints to the Utah Attorney General's office. And because they had reached out to the two officers listed for the PAC, who are two, renowned treasurers for Republican political action committees and Republican candidates' campaigns, who are based in Wisconsin. And these are some treasurers whose names have come up a number of times in stories around the country where there are questions about campaigns and political action committees maybe not following campaign finance laws, not being as transparent as they're supposed to be under the law. And they didn't respond to the Lieutenant Governor's office, so they handed it over to the Attorney General's office. I haven't gotten information back from the Attorney General's office yet as to what they'll do to investigate the PACs, but we'll see.
It's hard to parse out what has an effect in campaigns. Do we think these ads had an effect that they ran against these Democrats?
In a lot of races, no, because a lot of the Democratic lawmakers that it targeted were in pretty solidly blue districts. But there was one district in Ogden, it's where there was the only Democratic state lawmaker outside of Salt Lake County. Representative Rosemary Lesser was there. And that district is traditionally pretty purple, and it's usually a pretty tight race between a Democrat and a Republican. And she ended up losing her race. And I talked to House Minority Leader Angela Romero, and she said that she's pretty confident that this PAC played a role in that. And so, Representative Lesser ended up losing her race by just over 300 votes. And there was a lot of messaging in that race around, transgender rights issues. And when you go to Preserving Utah Values PAC's website, that's the name of the political action committee that's been running these ads. Representative Lesser's name was listed at the top of the Democratic lawmakers that it was targeting, where it was the lawmakers that they described as, quote, voting against Utah's girls.
Any comment from Democrats in the legislature that have now found out that their Speaker Schultz was putting up money to run against them?
I had been talking to Democrats in the legislature about the ads for a while, but so far I've only spoken with House Minority Leader Angela Romero about Speaker Schultz being the key funder of these ads. And she said repeatedly that she was disappointed to find out about that. She typically has a pretty good working relationship with him from her point of view. And so she wasn't, disappointed was the word that she used over and over to describe how she felt about it. But she also said that, having been targeted with the ads herself, she received a lot of, positive feedback from constituents thanking her for standing up for transgender members of the community. She also received some negative feedback, and among that negative feedback were some somewhat threatening messages. And she talked about how, that outlines, that highlights for her some of what these ads do for transgender Utahns, as far as how that impacts how other people around the state will treat them, but also, just how it impacts how transgender Utahns might see themselves. And so for when I talked to state lawmakers about these ads, for a lot of them, that was one of their top fears was, they talked about how they had transgender constituents who were getting these ads and how troubling that was for them.
Oh, thanks for telling us about this story. And I'm sure it's ongoing because we'll maybe learn more as other deadlines come around for reporting on PACs. I want to turn, Emily, to another story you had looking at the demographic breakdown of the new legislature, 2025 legislature, to be coming in. What are some of the highlights, demographic breakdown of our new legislature?
Well, Utah's made headlines a number of times for ranking pretty low as far as women's equality, especially when it comes to politics, political representation. This year, the legislature will have a record-breaking, well, next year, the legislature will have a record-breaking number of women, but that number will still be below a third, less than a third of the legislature. So men will still have a supermajority in the body. And it's still mostly white. There are a lot of, while not all, communities of color are underrepresented in the body, the majority are underrepresented. And so, the legislature is becoming a little bit more diverse, but it's not quite at proportional representation for a lot of Utah's marginalized communities.
I guess if you're looking for diversity, good news if you're a Pacific Islander, right? That number jumped.
Right. Currently there aren't any Pacific Islander lawmakers in the legislature, and this year there were 3 elected, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. And so there will be proportional representation for Pacific Islander community. And, Utah is pretty unique in that it's the only continental state with more than 1% of its population identifying as Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. And so, the only state besides Hawaii. And so in the past, like, this community's voices has not entirely been represented in the legislature as policies are being made. And, you've heard a lot of excitement from Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians about how policy might look different going forward now that some of the issues that impact them will be heard a little more up on Capitol Hill.
So you talked about the number of women, the percentage of women in the legislatures has been growing. I guess that growth is pretty, kind of slow, still lagging behind national trends. You mentioned in your story there's a political action committee Republican women lead. So Republicans on that side. There are other groups, right? What are some of the women in the legislature saying about how they think legislation might be different from, if there are more women in the legislature?
Well, research has, looked into what it means when there is adequate political representation for women and when there's not. And, one thing that's a huge issue right now in state legislatures across the country is reproductive health policy around abortion, IVF, et cetera. And as you know, in the Dobbs decision in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court handed policymaking around that issues to essentially state legislatures. But, men have a supermajority in the Utah state legislature. And so they are the ones who are deciding which direction that policy will go in Utah. Uh, another other policy areas that representation impacts a lot of times. Well, and I will say the vast majority of the women in the legislature, not all, are mothers, and many of them are also mothers of minor children who are, still in school. And generally, research has shown that when mothers are in lawmaking bodies, they tend to be more likely to address problems that affect families, parents, and children, like childcare, education, healthcare for children, housing. And so it really, as academics have dug into what different lawmaking bodies look like, what lawmakers' identities mean for the type of legislation they bring, they found that it does make a difference when there are women in legislatures. I will say that this is an issue that's been talked about for a long time in Utah, just because of how low, as I mentioned before, it's ranked when it comes to political representation for women. There was a political action committee that Republican lawmakers formed in 2021 called Republican Women Lead. And in those 4 years, there are now several more Republican women serving the legislature than there were before.
Well, thanks for telling us about this story as well. Just a couple of minutes on this one, just very briefly, and then we'll do underplayed stories of the week. You and Jeff Barrett reported on a Q&A that U.S. Senator-elect John Curtis gave. John Curtis, it was reported, would have maybe voted against Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. Matt Gaetz has removed himself now. What did Senator-elect Curtis say? Is he leaning against any of the other Trump appointees?
Well, right now he was kind of mum on saying where he actually sits, but he did talk about the importance of the vetting process for cabinet appointments. And, he essentially said he thinks that for some of the more controversial nominees, that as they go through that vetting process and as they talk to senators about whether they'll be confirmed, he thinks that some of that will, quote, resolve themselves. Kind of similar to Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida, who was, nominated for Attorney General, but had a number of allegations against them, including around sex trafficking and drug use, and had been investigated by the House Ethics Committee. And he ended up stepping down himself, withdrawing his name from consideration for that post. And, Representative Curtis, or Senator-elect Curtis now, essentially said that he believes that with some of the more controversial nominees, that as the vetting process goes on, if it's going to be an issue, it'll handle itself.
All right. Thanks for telling us about all three of these stories, Emily Anderson Stern. So do you have an underplayed story of the week?
See, there are a number this week. Sorry, I am.
We brought this forward a little bit because our next segment is recorded. So,
right. And I think I will highlight one from my colleague Robert Gerke that actually looked into, after Constitutional Amendment D was voided from the ballot, what plans lawmakers have to bring it back again.
Yeah, that's a good one. Robert Gerke's story. SLTrib.com for that and all these stories, including the ones we talked about from Emily Anderson Stern. We've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern. Emily, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
And following a break, we'll be have a recorded conversation with Palak Jaiswal. Talked to her yesterday, culture and music reporter. She, along with her colleagues, Peggy Fletcher-Stack and Tamara Kemsley, have the latest in a series of reports. The headline, Utah's Latter-day Saint versus non-Latter-day Saint divide, how it complicates dating, sex, and the quest for lasting love. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. More following this. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We're bringing now Salt Lake Tribune culture and music reporter Palak Jaiswal. Palak, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So we want to talk about a couple of stories. I guess it amounts to about three because there's a video story, two print and one video. This is an ongoing series the Tribune's doing on Utah's Latter-day Saint versus non-Latter-day Saint divide. And the first one was a series of stories about neighborhoods, how those are divided, maybe sometimes united across that divide. This part of the series, very interesting. I'll just read the subheadline, How This Divide Complicates Dating, Sex, and the Quest for Lasting Love. And so Peggy Fletcher-Stack, Tamara Kemsley, and yourself were involved in this, so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, definitely. This is a great series, like you mentioned, that the Religion Desk has been doing, and I got to work with Peggy and Tamara on this dating story, so I'm excited to talk about it.
All right. Well, let's start with kind of the main story. The story points out that I think a lot of us know across that divide, Latter-day Saints have a view of eternal marriage, right? So the stakes are pretty high.
Yes. Religion in Utah particularly plays a really big role in dating, as Peggy, Tamara, and I discovered. And that's from varying areas of the spectrum, right, of how religious you are. We talk to people who are very devout in the LDS faith, and we talk to people who, used to be LDS or are not anymore. And we also talk to people who generally look for non-religious people to date in Utah. And so basically a summary of what we found is that religion plays a really big role no matter where you stand on faith.
So you guys talked to Kendra Davis. She's a mechanical engineer. She is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was very interesting to me. This quote jumped out at me. She dated a person who was not a member of the church. And he, I guess when she broke up, or guess they broke up, he said, I feel like you were judging me. He said, I'm a good person. And that kind of shocked her. That she thought, well, yeah, I know you're a good person, but you can't, you're not a part of my religion.
Yeah, definitely. So Kendra was one of the people that Tamara found for the story. But I think what that kind of anecdote and scenario shows is that, religion is not just thought of in terms of, someone who might be very faithful, like Kendra, is thinking about their future, but also when they're in relationships with people who might not be religious or maybe are less religious than they are, that kind of mindset also affects that other person. So I think that is a really good example of how, religion plays into dating, even with someone who is very devout, like Kendra.
She went on to say, for me, it's she compared it to, I want to go to business school, so I'm not going to apply to an art school. So, both are valid, right? But she chooses the other. You have some photographs in here of large singles groups within the church. There's a huge singles scene, and it can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, definitely. So some of those pictures are from a Utah Youth Single Adult Conference that happened in August earlier this year. My understanding is it's kind of a conference type thing where singles in the church can come and dance and attend devotionals and volleyball tournaments, and they get to do stuff like hear sermons and speed date. And it's just kind of a good way to get I think a lot of young LDS people into the same area.
You guys talked to one lady who had left the church and had come back. She said, I guess it's complicated on either side. This was
Yes,
Kristen
definitely.
Jacks, I think.
Kristen Jacks.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, that was also another person that Tamara talked to. But I think really all of these people in this story, they kind of show that religion, whether you're currently religious or were used to be religious or not religious at all, it continues to play a really vital role in dating dynamics in Utah.
Then there were a few people you talked to for the story who had left the church, like Lindsay Allen, who lives in Virgin, so 700 people. I imagine that would restrict your dating pool anyway, right? She says it's kind of complicated leaving the church. Then some Latter-day Saint guys don't want to date her.
Yeah, Lindsay was very interesting to talk to because, as you mentioned, there's under 700 residents in Virgin, which is, a southern Utah town. And Lindsay was telling me her dating apps constantly, tell her that she's run out of people to look at in her area. And so she has also dated up in Salt Lake City. And when she was still a part of the church and a member, very focused on LDS culture and what that influences in dating, she had a really easy time finding people. But then as she started leaving the church, it became more difficult. She said that she got rejected a lot because she was, quote, not Mormon enough for a lot of the men she was talking to. And so this is a good example of how religion still sticks around even if you're not religious yourself.
There's a young woman in the story. Her name was Geneva Humbert, raised Catholic, dated some Latter-day Saint fellows. One guy she describes as she thinks he was the love of her life. I guess things started changing when he wanted his Latter-day Saint mission.
Yeah. Geneva was one of the people that Peggy was able to find. But her story, she talked about how this, partner that she was with tried to kind of force religious stuff on her, and she personally could not imagine being an LDS member. And when he was sent away again, he came back and then they went on a date, but they realized that their differences were just too great. She kind of detailed, I think, in the story, he gave her a copy of his missionary photo. He gave her a Book of the Mormon, and she just didn't feel very comfortable with that. And so when she, expressed that to him and told him, this isn't what I want anymore, he was very emotional about it. And so now she's 23, she's a flight attendant, and she is dating someone who's non-LDS. In the story, Peggy has a line that where Geneva says, she feels like she can finally be herself.
There's a woman called Taylor Lay. She describes the dating scene in one word: tense. I guess that could describe any dating scene, but I guess especially across this divide.
Yeah, Taylor was particularly interesting. She is one of the people I talked to, and she's one of the younger people I talked to for this story, and she's a student at Utah Valley University. She's not LDS. She describes herself as left-leaning, political-wise, and so all of those factors combined is kind of why I think she described the dating scene as tense, particularly in Utah County, where there are different dynamics going on. Taylor has a line in the story where she talks about how half of the college campus is engaged or married, and sometimes she feels like, why am I not in a serious relationship, and has thoughts of what's wrong with me? And so she's had to really kind of correct that mindset and realize that she just, thinks differently and has different values and different ideas of what she wants in a relationship versus maybe the bigger population in Utah County. And it's just an interesting contrast to see how it differs for young people, to see, because young people in college, this is the prime dating pool, you would say, right? Or you would consider. And so the religious divide when it comes to college kids is also very present.
Yeah, you did a video on this, right? On that particular area, dating in college.
Yeah, Trevor Christensen is our videographer. He's great. He and I spent a whole day out at UVU and then the University of Utah, and we just talked to college kids. Some were aged as young as 18, 19 to, I think, 23. And we talked to about, I think, 10 kids, and we just asked them, like, how does religion affect your dating life? And so at UVU, we got a lot of people who, were LDS, and they talked about how that plays into their kind of mindset in dating and the dynamics they're looking for. We talked to one couple who started dating in high school, then they both went on their missions at the same time, and now that they're back, they're still together, and they're so grateful that they met in high school because, they hear horror stories from their friends, and going on their missions, they were able to communicate through letters and stuff, and it really helped strengthen their relationship. And that was like a complete opposite dynamic to what we got at the U, where we talked to, people who were, maybe LGBTQ, or people who were looking for maybe less religious people. One person we talked to at the U, she's Hindu, and she talked about how she's dating someone who's non-Hindu, and that plays into her dating dynamic too. So I think sometimes when we think about religion in Utah, we tend to think only about, the LDS faith because that's the prominent religion here. But there's also these dynamics that are happening that are similar in different religions too.
Of course, one question that comes up is sex, right? Physical intimacy. Some of the non-Latter-day Saint folks said there's a stereotype that they encounter when a Latter-day Saint person wants to date a person not of their faith. Especially women, members of the church, feel like if they date a non-member, they're going to be pressured for sex immediately.
You're dating people who maybe aren't of the LDS faith. Do they have that same value, shared value? There's pressure to maybe do things they're not ready for or don't believe in. And so that's something that plays into account too.
Some of the women that you guys talked to for the series in the church talked about the fact that they felt that there weren't enough eligible men in the church, and that they faced this choice as they saw it of being lonely or trying to find somebody outside the faith.
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting thing to bring up because, earlier in this conversation, we talked about, the singles conference, right? So I think, obviously, we don't know what every single person is looking for, but if women are not finding the partner that they're seeking, then maybe there are other dynamics at play, right? So a lot of what we've talked about today is about how religion affects dating in Utah. But even as we see in the story, even devout religious people are having problems finding their partner. And so it kind of begs the question of what else is coming into play here. Is it different ideas? Is it different values? In this case, for these women, I'm not sure what the difference is or what they're not finding or what they are finding and they don't like. But it's complicated to date right now. And I think when you add religion on top of it, it just complicates it even more.
I guess some of the folks, I think especially young women in the church, are saying that they encounter a stereotype. They're encountering people outside the church. People outside the church are viewing the young Latter-day Saint folks as a monolith. And they're saying, no, there's a broader range of diversity among the church members.
Yeah, definitely, right? And I think we don't get into this a ton in this story, which is very long and very thorough. But I think when you talk about this, one thing we can also mention is we have a lot of people who are moving to Utah, right, who haven't been here before. And maybe their only idea of what Utah is, something they've learned about through social media and TikTok, where I think, unfortunately, some of these stereotypes about LDS people and the LDS faith tend to go viral. So sometimes you have to work extra hard to combat those stereotypes if you're dating someone who is out of state.
You have a section here in the story about online dating, and just anecdotally, I'm talking to a fair number of folks in the church who are meeting online these days. You do bring up the app Mutual. That's what I'm hearing from a lot of the folks I'm talking to. We met on Mutual, so that is for, I guess, members of the church because it's designed that way. But I guess people on both sides of the divide are using Tinder, Bumble, others.
Yeah, dating apps is a really great part of the story, I think, because a lot of young people, in particular, that's the way that they're meeting people. I think it's different if you ask, someone 20, 30 years ago how they met their partner or their husband or wife, they'll say, oh, I met them at school. And I think that's different now. So the way young people are meeting these days is through dating apps, which have their complications of their own. Mutual, like you mentioned, is an app that exists with this explicit intent to match with fellow Latter-day Saints, right? Although there's a lot of non-Latter-day Saint men who also use the app, as Kendra Davis told us. But an interesting thing about dating apps is, you can put filters on stuff. You can really narrow down the type of person you're looking for. So when we talk about this in connection with religion, one of the people I talked to for this story is Kate Wiseman. She's a former Latter-day Saint, but she no longer practices. And when she was searching for a potential partner, she had a filter on, I believe it was her Hinge profile, which is another dating app that said she was specifically looking for someone who is not religious. And that's how she found her current boyfriend. It's interesting because I think back 20, 30 years ago, you could go to someone and talk to them over a coffee or dinner about these aspects. But now people are doing it over apps. And some people aren't completely honest on apps, which is something I heard from a lot of the younger people I talked to for this story, that apps, kind of are meant, I think they're designed to help filter these different dynamics out, but also kind of lend themselves to a sense of anonymity and concern and more of a platform for people to fib or not be honest. So it is a very interesting dynamic, I think.
And on the other side of that, you guys talked to one young lady who kind of went back and forth on what exactly to put in her biography. I guess she kept BYU as her alma mater, even though she knew that would eliminate, a lot of guys who would see that as a kind of a marker.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting. I think dating profiles are kind of the modern version of MySpace, right? You can make it anything you want. And this goes to social media in general, right? Like, you can represent yourself in any way you want. Just as if you're looking for someone to date and your 30-mile radius living in Salt Lake City isn't bringing up any options, maybe you increase that distance to 50 miles and you find someone, in Park City. That's all these options and these labels and all of this stuff that makes your dating profile really has a play in how you find people.
You have a section in this story. I love this subheadline, Meet the Worried Parents. You say that, a lot of parents don't try to get too involved. Of course, kids don't want them too involved, but they're white-knuckling it, right? Hoping that their child does not marry outside the faith.
Yeah, this was a section that Peggy Fletcher-Stack worked on, and she talked to Rabbi Samuel Spector, who leads the congregation Kol Ami. And, he has a quote in the story that says, as a Jew, rabbi, and father, I hope and pray that my children grow up to marry loving, wonderful partners. At the same time, we see that most interfaith couples do not raise their children Jewish. So parents also play a dynamic when it comes to dating, right? And when it comes to religion and dating, that's the same thing. We kind of did a breakout second story when it comes to LGBTQ dating in the LDS world in Utah. And one of the people I talked to for that story, his name is Matt Fuller. he grew up LDS, and he even married a woman in the church, and they were together for, I think, about 10 or 12 years, if I'm remembering correctly. They have a couple of children together, and he told me, on the second date with his ex-wife, he told her that he was gay, and they decided to go forward anyway. But he definitely felt very compelled to conform to the church's teachings, especially when it comes to eternal families, because that's how he grew up. That was kind of what his family, knew, right? And he has a quote in the story where he says, "I almost broke free, but then family pressure led me to get back on the path that Mormons want you to be on, and that wound up in me marrying my ex-wife." And so I think, these pressures that come from religion that people might feel pressured by or influenced by, they have a really active role in dating in Utah.
I just want to read a couple lines here. This would probably be for Peggy Fletcher Stack. Just the stakes for the Latter-day Saints that I mentioned at the beginning of the hour of the segment. For some Latter-day Saint parents, it could be less about this world and more about the next. Will there be an empty seat in their family's highest heaven? So if you believe in marriage is forever, but only if you're sealed in the temple, then the stakes are very high. There can be a flip side. In this section, it's probably Peggy talked to former Latter-day Saint Tom Merrill, 40-year-old dad of two, so he's left the church, and he doesn't want a charming guy coming around his daughter when the time's right to try to convert her.
Yeah, that's interesting. And even Matt Fuller, this didn't make it into the written copy of the story, but we talked a lot about his take as a family father who has kids too, and how he wants his children to be able to make their own decisions when they come of age. And so I think a lot of this is also, a generational thing, right? So, maybe younger people are more willing to try different things or become different or break the mold, so to say, right? And so that's something that parents have to grapple with too. And I think Peggy does a great job in our story talking about that.
This final section of this story, I want to get on to the another story you're involved in this series. So a fellow named Jeff Combe met a cute girl dancing at an East High prom. So he was reared as an evangelical Christian. This girl turned out to be Latter-day Saint. There's some bumps along the road, but I guess the upshot of this, he converted. And I guess his parents weren't all that happy.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right, to see the two different sides of how religion and converting to religion play out. And so for Jeff, he decided to make that choice, and he worked out. But it is interesting, in the story we note that his parents ended up being there to celebrate with them at the Salt Lake Temple, but as non-members, they couldn't go inside.
So let's turn to another story. You're kind of the lead author on this one: Latter-day Saint versus non-Latter-day Saint divide. LGBTQ Utahns navigate complex dating world and forbidden relationships. So the church's stance is, if you can't get married to a same-sex partner, right? And still be good standing, and you have to abstain from sex with any partner to be in good standing, and so that leads to added complications among this community.
Yeah, definitely. And we've been talking a lot about, how religion complicates dating in general, but I think it's even more of a complication for people who identify as LGBTQ+. One of the people I talked to for this story, her name is Tennille Taggart, and she described dating in Utah as an LGBTQ person as very difficult. Part of that is, for Tennille, when she grew up in Centerville here in Utah, she didn't even have this idea in her head that she could be gay. And so when she didn't understand that. She didn't realize until later in her life that she was, lesbian. And she ended up moving to West Hollywood in about 2007. And that was really where she was able to kind of figure herself out. But when she was here in Utah, she said that there's a quote in the story that says, "I was totally in denial because of the church's teachings, unaware of just any kind of sexuality or what that looks like." So I think that's one dynamic, is this idea that you could be LGBTQ, right? And that is something that you can pursue as long term, and it's not something that might go away or that kind of stuff. That's what Tennille kind of really talked about in the story.
You talked to Matt Fuller, a gay former Latter-day Saint. He says he dates outside of Utah. He says, "I was exhausted trying to make it work here." Why was it exhausting?
So the way Matt described the dating game in Utah as an LGBTQ person was kind of a game because he kept bumping into these issues of secrecy and lack of openness. He kind of details, he personally, and then I think just anecdotes he's heard from friends is you would go out with someone who maybe was of the same sex, right? But because of the religious influence in Utah, some dating behaviors would result in those areas, like ghosting, which is when, someone just drops off and stops talking to someone entirely. Just antisocial types of interaction and internalized forms of homophobia. And so one thing that Matt brings up in the story is, some people who might still be practicing LDS members who are trying to keep up with appearances with their extended family, they'll say simple things like, "I'm going out on a date," or "I'm seeing somebody," or "I'm hanging out with my friend," but they never really, expand on that or give details. And, they won't bring this person to family gatherings. And so it kind of brings this element of shame and taboo that Matt personally was just kind of tired of having to go through.
Now, you talked to one woman, Jennifer West, who is a member of the church. Her partner is a member of the church. They're living together, not married, I guess, not having sex. So they're both in good standing in the church.
Yeah, Jennifer is, I co-wrote this story with Tamara, and Tamara is the one who found Jennifer. But Jennifer talks about how she found her current partner named Becca in this support group for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. It's called North Star. And she, Jennifer herself, really wanted to find someone who would still navigate religion with her. And so she was able to find Becca through that group. And I think they describe their life together as actually pretty great. So, there are people who are finding ways to still be who they want to be.
There's you end the story with Zach Alba and his partner, Paul Christian. I don't know if you were the one to talk to them. Can you tell me about them?
I did, yeah. So Zach lives in Centerville. He says that he grew up very Mormon. His father is a bishop, and his partner, Paul, he grew up in Alaska in a household that wasn't religious at all. So a lot of their relationship has been navigating just like someone who isn't religious and someone who's very religious or was very religious. Or their family is very religious, I should say. So, one of the things that they brought up was, Zach's family has family events a couple of times a month. They do Sunday dinner all the time. And for Paul, that was very weird because he grew up in a very secular family. And so going to a family dinner every week was kind of an adjustment for Paul. And, that's not necessarily a religious thing, so to say, right? But it's kind of a cultural thing is, there's a lot of family gatherings in the LDS faith. And so that's something they've navigated. And both Zach and Paul are people of color, which is something they said has also impacted both of their dating experiences in Utah. Alba, Zach, he remembers growing up as the only brown kid around. And he did date a few ex-Mormon white people, but there's never really anything that he felt like he could relate to with that person. And so for Zach and Paul, I think there's a lot of learning from each other, right? Like they're learning about family. Zach's family is very supportive of them, which is great. But it's also kind of navigating this shared experience of being a person of color in Utah and dating in that world.
So, what strikes you most, PAC? Having been involved in these stories, this latest in the series.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this series is that dating is very hard, and I think that's maybe a simple way to put it. But dating is very hard anywhere, but it's very hard in Utah too. And so I think it's very easy. I've heard anecdotes from some of the people I've talked to, that it's frustrating in that they're tired, in that they feel like they can't find their person or there's no one out there for them. And that's such a shared experience that we've heard from people all across the faith spectrum in this story. And so I think that's my biggest takeaway is that sometimes, not being able to find someone to connect with or to form a relationship with, that's a very alienating feeling. But it's a feeling that a lot of people, it seems like, are going through in one way or another.
Well, thanks for telling us about this, Utah's Latter-day Saint versus non-Latter-day Saint divide, how it complicates dating, sex, and the quest for lasting love. There's also another story on LGBTQ Utahns navigating the dating world, and a video about dating in college. We've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune culture and music reporter PAC Jaiswal, who, along with Peggy Fletcher-Stack and Tamara Kemsley, have produced this latest in the series. PAC, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thanks, everyone, for listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune. We'll be back next week.